Hello, this is Unsung with GameLeap, and today we're going to be giving you the top 10 most overpowered builds for each role on patch 13.18. If you want LP before next patch, you need to abuse these builds and champions now before they get nerfed. One of our champion choices normally has a 49% win rate, but with our strongest build available, this win rate skyrockets up to 57%. Make sure to like and comment on the video if any of these builds help you on your climb. We're going to be going role by role, starting with top lane. Renekton is our first OP pick for the video. This champion is absolutely unfair this patch, but only if we itemize him in a certain way. Goredrinker and Stridebreaker are both really solid mythic options, but they do two different things. Stridebreaker is better for diving squishies or for getting picks on the side lane, whereas Goredrinker is good for extended fights or being a tanky bruiser for your front line. Generally, Goredrinker is easier to play, so I would recommend going this mythic option. Next up, we always want to go Spear of Shojin. This is largely because of how Renekton's cooldowns work. Renekton is incredibly reliant on getting a rotation with Rage off. If he does not have enough Fury to empower his ability, then he's not going to be super effective. If we use our ultimate and we're dashing in an enemy team while building Fury, the likelihood of us getting a second rotation is significantly higher due to having Shojin. This item reduces our E cooldown from an average of 7 seconds late game to 5 seconds late game. This is a huge difference and will allow us so much more playmaking potential, which is why we always want this third. Next up, we want to go Cleaver as a fourth item and then either Sterix or Ma as a fifth item. If you're interested in taking your gameplay to the next level, head over to GameLeap.com by clicking on the description box below. I have spent years making champion courses with the best tips, tricks, and techniques for you to devour. Don't miss out on these. Head to the website now so you can climb rank after rank. Aatrox is next on our list. The changes that Aatrox has received this patch have moved him into a really stable but strong position. Both Goredrinker and Duskblade are solid on this champion, but into different things for different reasons. Heavy melee and tanks on the enemy team means that we want to build Goredrinker. Squishies and range champions, then we definitely want a Duskblade. Let's go ahead and cover our Goredrinker build first. Goredrinker into armor or MR boots based on our matchup. Next up, we always want to go Cyrilda's Grudge as a third item. The reason is that it makes Aatrox significantly easier to pilot. When we have that little bit of extra slow on each Q rotation or the increased slow on our W, it just makes us a lot more consistent. For this reason, we always want to go Grudge third. Next up, Sterix is of course the most overpowered bruiser item. We have to slot it here, followed by a Black Cleaver and then a Guardian Angel. Next up, for our Duskblade build, we want to go Duskblade first into boots of our choice, and then once again Cyrilda's Grudge. However, this is where things get a little bit different. With this build, we don't have any HP, so we want to buy a Black Cleaver as our next item. Then we can follow this with a Sterix, and then finally a Guardian Angel like before. The goals of Duskblade and Goredrinker Aatrox are significantly different. Duskblade Aatrox wants to blow up people and then get into assassination positions, whereas Goredrinker Aatrox wants to play as a disruptor or a drain tank in the middle of the enemy team. Now that we've covered our top laners, let's go ahead and talk about our junglers. Jarvan 4 is without a doubt the most overpowered jungler on this patch, and this is simply due to Spear of Shojin being so overbuffed, which is why we always want to start our build with Spear of Shojin on this champion. Goredrinker just simply does not offer the amount of haste that Shojin does, and while the active is nice, it does not make up for the sheer amount of utility that we get out of Shojin. Ionian Boots of Lucidity are next in our build, and this is simply due to how much playmaking potential that these grant. This early game ability haste is incredibly necessary on J4 because he's not really super strong late game. Next up, we finish our Goredrinker, and then after that, we go Black Cleaver. Cleaver once again gives us a huge amount of ability haste, so we're actually able to make plays on the map, but the stat line just overall synergizes very well with J4 due to the double armor shred stacking. Next up, we want a GA, so we're able to access Stopwatch earlier on in the game. And for a sixth item, we can choose between either Sterix Gauge, Deadman's Plate, or Death Stance depending on our game, with Sterix being the strongest option here. Now that we covered our strongest champion, let's go ahead and talk about the second strongest jungler, which without a doubt is Hecarim. Hecarim is who we're referencing when we're talking about that win rate earlier on in the video. If we play the proper Hecarim build, our win rate actually goes up a full 8%. We need to play this champion correctly. In order to play him correctly, we want to start with Blue Smite. Blue Smite is incredibly strong on Hecarim because of the synergy with his passive, Warpath. Next up, we always want to rush Ionian Shoes on this champion. Now we want to rush Spear Shojin as fast as possible after our Ionian Shoes. The reason for this is once again, Hecarim gets a huge amount of value from having early ability haste, and the stat line on Shojin is overall really nice. Now we can choose between either going Stridebreaker or Goredrinker. We usually want Stridebreaker in 9 out of 10 games, but Goredrinker is a playable alternative if we want to play a more bruiser style of Hecarim. Sterix Gauge is our next item in this build because of the huge amount of tenacity and shielding that it grants us. This will ensure that we can stay on the enemy backline without having to worry about getting blown up. Next, we can follow this with a Black Cleaver for the ability haste and armor shred that it does have, and then we can finish off our build with either a Death Stance or a Guardian Angel depending on our preference. This build makes Hecarim into a disgusting 1v9 machine that is simply too fast to stop, that hits too hard, and is too tanky to deal with. This is a must-have build in your repertoire. Now that we've covered junglers, let's go ahead and move on to mids. The two mids that I've selected here are going to be an AD and an AP mid to cover every situation. Zed is going to be our AD pick, and while Zed is a high skill cap champion, this build removes all the skill from him and turns him into a autopilot 1v9 machine. First and foremost, we rush a Ravenous Hydra. This item is simply too strong in its current state on Zed because it does allow him to have near infinite wave clear. Following Hydra, we want to go Ionian Boots into a Duskblade of Drakthar. This is generally going to be our build path the majority of the time that we play this champion simply due to the 3 item synergy that we have. Ravenous Hydra gives ability haste, lifesteal, and wave clear. Ionian Boots grant us early ability haste as well as summoner's cooldown reduction. And then Duskblade gives us a hugely increased amount of damage simply due to the passive that it has as well as ability haste and of course the untarget ability. Next up, we want to go Black Cleaver for the ability haste and the damage, followed by a Cyrilda's Grudge and then a GA, or we can also replace Black Cleaver with Axiom Arc. We only want to do this if we're snowballing and we're able to make use out of our ultimate primarily. If we're not snowballing, then we want to stay away from Axiom Arc and instead just go this build path. Speaking of unskilled setups, let's go ahead and talk about Vex. This champion has been overbuffed to a pretty laughable degree. Vex is very easy to pick up, incredibly easy to master, but super effective in just about every game as a solo AP carry. Our strongest mythic on Vex is going to be Luden's Tempest. The reason for this is simply because of the amount of extra damage that it gives us over the course of a combo. Next up, we want to go Sorcerer's Shoes for the sheer amount of damage that they grant, and then stay away from Ionians. Vex doesn't make too much use out of Ionians, and her Q scales down to about a 3-second cooldown once we hit level 9. For our third completed item, we want a Shadow Flame, simply for the magic penetration as well as the upfront AP that it does grant us. We then follow this with a Zhonya's Hourglass, so we're able to dive deep after blowing somebody up, use the Zhonya's to save ourselves, and then reset our cooldowns inside of the Zhonya's active. Death Cap is the next item in this build for the pure amount of AP that it grants us, followed by a Void Staff for the magic penetration. Now that we covered our mid laners, let's go ahead and move on to marksmen. Let's go ahead and talk about Ezreal first. Duskblade is king on this champion as far as mythics go. Trinity Force Ezreal is decent, but it does not even compare to the strength of Duskblade. We actually don't even build our Duskblade until significantly later in the build, simply due to how strong the other component items in this build are going to be. For Ezreal, we always want to go Essence Reaver, followed by Ionian Shoes, into Muramana. This 3-item spike is huge by itself, but the second that we're able to finish our 4th item, which is going to be Duskblade, we turn into Exodia. This grants you a huge amount of damage, a huge amount of haste, and the potential to do whatever you want on the map. Our 5th item in this build is of course going to be Cyrilda's Grudge for the sheer amounts of slows that we'll be able to pump out, and then we can choose between either Ravenous Hydra or Guardian Angel for a 6th item. These are just really strong, solid items on Ezreal overall and turn him into more of an AD caster instead of an auto attacker, which is easier to play while also being more effective. This is just a really strong build overall that has no real drawback. Next up, we have Ashe. Ashe has a very simple build path, and it's simply due to this. Kraken Slayer is the best item for crit marksman in the game in its current form. There is no item that even compares to the amount of DPS and cost efficiency that Kraken Slayer grants. We always want to rush Kraken Slayer on the champion for the sheer amount of damage that it grants, and then we immediately want to follow this with Berserker's Greaves for even more damage. This will allow you to have a really strong early game and a decent mid game when we complete our mythic item, which is going to be Trinity Force 100% of the time. Trinity Force Ashe allows us to get excess movement speed for actually running people down. From this point onwards, we can choose between either going Blade of the Ruin King or Runon's Hurricane based on the enemy team, and then items such as Mortal Shield Bow, Lord Domus Regards, and then Bloodthirster. For a last item, we always want to go GA on Marksman. The reason this build is so strong is because it allows us to be durable, have a pretty nice power curve because we're getting most of our damage in the early game, and then have a huge amount of uptime on our passive, so we're able to be insane utility for our team. And finally, last but not least, let's go ahead and cover our supports. Blitzcrank is going to be our first pick here simply due to how effective he is in solo queue. Blitz can create picks by himself, he's very good at snowballing games, and will allow you to have impacts guaranteed in basically every single game that you play. As far as itemization goes, we always want to start Relic Shield on this champion for the passive that it grants us. Next, we always want to go directly into mobility boots. All of our itemization doesn't really grant us too much more damage, instead it grants us more opportunity to get picks. So for this reason, mobility boots are hands down on the strongest second item that we could get. For our mythic item, we can basically choose between any support mythic. Shurelia's if we want to get more picks, Locket for shielding against high damage after we get a pick, even Shroud against squishier teams, and then Everfrost for a little bit of trolling. Our build path after this is going to consist of Zeke's for the synergy that it has with Blitzcrank's displacements. We get a lot of immobilizations, which will ensure that we have a huge uptime on Zeke's. Next up, we want to go Knight's Vow, so that way we're actually tanking a little bit for our AD carry and then making use out of our mana barrier, and then we can choose between either going Redemption or Deadman's Play. It's really up to you here. Redemption is good if we're able to land a hook and then immediately use Redemption on top of ourselves, whereas Deadman's Play once again does grant us more opportunities to create picks. And finally, last but not least, we have Rakan. Rakan is one of the harder playmaking supports in the game, but he's incredibly strong this patch, so I highly recommend that you pick him up. For this build path, we're going to start with Relic Shield, because it does allow us to actually interact with the lane phase without having to rely on poking people like Spell Thieves. Next up, we want to go Ionian Shoes instead of Mobility Boots because Rakan needs Summoner uptime, as well as the amount of ability haste that they do grant. Ionians grant Rakan a lot more pressure during basically every stage of the game, meaning that we can't really go Mobies on this champion. Next, we always want to either go Shurelia's or Radiant Virtue on this champion. Radiant is really strong if we have a good economy and if we're snowballing in the early game, however Shurelia's is significantly cheaper and will give us more teamfight impact immediately. So it's really up to you here. This is a playstyle defining thing. We always want to follow our mythic item with a redemption on Rakan, and this is because the primary combo that we're going to be using. If we are and then W redemption immediately on top of ourselves, we're going to be able to hit 3 to 4 people with that 10% true damage, which absolutely nukes and can single-handedly swing a teamfight. Our next item has to be Zhonya's Hourglass. So Zhonya's is great for actually getting us into a fight and making sure that we get back out. And then finally, we can choose between either Knight's Vow, Deadman's Play, or other situational items. We don't generally want to itemize any sort of grievous wounds on Rakan because it's simply too hard for him to apply. Anyways, thank you all for watching. I hope that you all have a wonderful day. Make sure that you check out GabeLeap.com by clicking on the description box below if you guys want to learn more about any and everything League of Legends.